Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. Now, the ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi has appeared in a propaganda video for the first time in 5 years. A person who has a $25 million bounty on his head has reappeared looking very much alive and healthy after many erroneous reports in the past of him being seriously injured or even killed. In this 18-minute video that was released on Monday, Baghdadi accepted the defeat of ISIS in Syria and Iraq and promised revenge on its enemies, saying the attacks in Sri Lanka were in fact part of that revenge agenda. Meanwhile, in Sri Lanka, a government minister and a US diplomat have warned the public and the government that the group that carried out the attacks could launch further strikes. Also, we will be discussing a report by the Norwegian Refugee Council on the plight of some 45,000 displaced children with suspected ties to ISIS that are missing civil documentation, and they are facing a very uncertain future for the possibility of becoming stateless in Iraq. ISIS, of course, seized large areas in Syria and Iraq in 2014 and carried out mass killings, torture, and also sexual enslavement, which resulted in thousands of women giving birth after being raped by their captors. Now, these children right now have no final place to call home. What is their future? And we will be discussing with our guest today the significance of ISIS resurfacing, the lead, and what this could mean generally for the security and the situation of the world today. Let me introduce our guests. We have Mr. Kaunert, the global security expert based in Cardiff, London. Also joining us today is Mr. Mathew Bunker, the co-founder and managing director of ARX Risk, a security and risk management company. And he's also a former special forces officer right now based in Australia. And we are joined by Alexandra Saieh, advocacy manager of the Norwegian Refugee Council. She is joining us from Iraq, and she was part of this report that stated how thousands of children are right now stateless in Iraq. So let me start with you, Mr. Mathew. Let's talk about this video first of all. It has surfaced just about over a week after the attacks in Sri Lanka. What do we know about the authenticity of this video? How sure can we be that this is Baghdadi just from April?
Yeah, look, the intelligence services all around the world, and particularly the US, will be working very hard to prove its authenticity. As you said before, this is the first time we've seen Baghdadi in 5 years, and it's been a year since the rumours surfaced that he was severely injured. It's interesting to note, the video is definitely up to date. There's some up-to-date events that have been mentioned. Look, the re-election of the Israeli Prime Minister was mentioned. The removal of the Algerian and Sudanese presidents were also mentioned as well. As far as confirming that this is actually Baghdadi the man, it's hard to say at this point. But as I said, intelligence services all around the world will be working very hard over the coming weeks to really find out and prove its authenticity.
So, and Mr. Christian, while there is, of course, I understand security force intelligence agencies, like Mr. Mathew said, all around the world will be scrutinizing it. There's not much happening in the video in terms of the background. It's a white background. It's very hard to tell where this could be located. Also, if you could comment a little bit on the significance of the video showing up at a time like this.
Yes, I mean, it is, of course, very interesting that this video has come out just now as the war has clearly at least ended in Syria for ISIS, and the battle has clearly been lost. So this video is clearly an attempt to reposition ISIS away from what it was with Syria and Iraq towards other specters of international security. And of course, just after Sri Lanka, which is a significant terror attack, one of the most significant in recent years, is of course the right moment to rebrand ISIS as a force to be reckoned with. And of course, the video is an attempt to do just that. And as a result of that, it gives us a few insights into the new ideas that ISIS wants to be pushing forward and so on. So I think it is interesting in its rebranding.
It's interesting in its rebranding. Also, there's something you mentioned here, Mr. Christian, that ISIS, Mr. Baghdadi says this in his video as well, that we have accepted defeat. Is this, in a way, a kind of trying to make a comeback or rallying support amongst those foreign fighters spread across the world?
Absolutely. This is the main purpose of the video in a way, because of course the appeal of ISIS will go down very, very significant, has gone down in fact over the last year too. And now with the new terror attacks in Sri Lanka, there's an attempt to gain momentum and to really attract followers, something that's been losing battle over the last couple of years, really.
So it also brings into question whether ISIS really had that ability or power to have the funding and the resources, Mr. Mathew, to have carried out that attack in Sri Lanka, considering while they did step up 2 days later to take responsibility of the attack, they didn't really have any kind of credible evidence that could have proven that, yes, for sure, ISIS was behind this.
Yeah, look, in relation to claiming any responsibility, I think ISIS don't really feel they need to show any evidence. You know, this is how ISIS have been operating over the last 5 years since Baghdadi claimed a caliphate across Iraq and Syria. You know, it's the modus operandi of terrorist organisations to claim any spectacular attack as theirs. It's essentially a free propaganda opportunity for them. And as Christian was talking about, they've come off some really significant defeats. They've actually been crushing strategically and psychologically for them. So Sri Lanka really offers them an opportunity to boost their supporters' confidence in the fact that, you know, that it's still ISIS versus the rest of the world.
But was there, Mr. Mathew, prior to this attack in Sri Lanka, any kind of credible evidence, information or intelligence report that could have alerted the government or the agencies in Sri Lanka that there is a growing presence of ISIS there?
Look, I think that there was some reports, and Sri Lanka themselves have freely admitted that they've let this go through to the goalkeeper, so to speak, and there was some evidence suggesting that there was a group looking to do an attack. But as far as linking it towards ISIS, I haven't seen any reporting indicating that that is the case. And so whether or not that is a fact that ISIS are behind this, or ISIS are just using this as a means of propaganda to reaffirm with their supporters that they are still alive and well.
Right. So, Mr. Christian, is it concerning, and how concerned? I'm sure it is concerning. But how bad is this a situation as it's evolving when a small, relatively unknown organization like the National Tawhid Jamaat in Sri Lanka that claimed to have carried out this attack, if it's did carry it out, it shows how well organized, funded and coordinated it was in Sri Lanka. And then there's clearly some kind of association it has with ISIS or other terrorist organizations that could have helped in carrying this out.
I mean, in a sense, it is showing us two things. The first thing is the specter of the theater moves slightly away from the West, and it's moving towards areas where security can still be a little bit circumvented. And Sri Lanka was just that precisely because people did not think of Sri Lanka as the first point of call. This might happen is one of the reasons why it actually shifted towards Sri Lanka, because it was a possibility that would have been much harder, let's say, in France or in the United Kingdom or somewhere in the West. Nonetheless, the scale of the attack gives us cause to be concerned. There's no doubt about that, because the scale was very, very significant. We had a number of explosions. We had very significant loss of life. And in fact, it may not be completely over. The security services have not stopped all the cells that may still be operating in Sri Lanka. So it is concerning in that sense, but it is also a sign of a weakened ISIS at the same time. So I think we might be looking at both.
So, Mr. Mathew, what is your opinion? Is this, and I know you mentioned a little bit about this, of trying to take advantage of it as a propaganda opportunity, but ISIS may be weakening or having a shift in their positions where they are strategically positioned in the global theater of war and conflict?
Yeah, I think Christian's point about ISIS targeting weaker links, I think in this case is very true. These terrorists have seen an opportunity within a country that is potentially more stretched than Christian just talked about within Europe, USA and other Western countries to really stop these types of attacks. The other thing to think about here as well is that because ISIS have been defeated in Iraq and Syria, there's an exodus of foreign fighters leaving these countries and returning home. So there's that knowledge and that skill that has been obtained through conflict within Iraq and Syria, returning back into Asia and Southeast Asia. And so that is perhaps a reason why these attacks were essentially very, very well thought out and conducted, is because these individuals may have returned home and have gained skills in war-torn Iraq and Syria.
I'm glad you brought up this point of the exodus of fighters that is now being expected or being seen from the Middle East, essentially from Iraq and Syria, because a report, and Ms. Alexandra, you were part of this report by the Norwegian the Refugee Council that essentially highlighted a really alarming situation for thousands of children in Iraq who right now don't really have a country that they can call home. In fact, they're probably in a position where nobody wants them.
Yeah, so our research found that an estimated 45,000 children in displacement camps in Iraq are missing civil documentation, specifically birth certificates. And this problem actually impacts children beyond, it's beyond children whose parents or relatives may have ties to ISIS, but actually impacts children whose parents fled ISIS's brutal rule. It impacts children whose parents had their IDs confiscated while living under ISIS control, and children whose parents' IDs may have been confiscated for one reason or another by the Iraqi government. It's something that needs to be addressed immediately and largely impacts children under 5 or 6 who were born during ISIS's rule.
So this is, you mentioned, largely impacts children under the age of 5 or 6. What about if, do you have an idea, is this research conveyed, what is the majority of these children, which age group are they in?
Yeah, that's the age group. They're very young, under 5 or 6, born in the last 5 years. But it's actually not something that has stopped. Every day there are children who are born without birth certificates because their parents have still not been able to obtain IDs for one reason or another. So it's something that could spiral if it's not immediately addressed.
And why are they considered stateless, considering they were born in Iraq and would essentially have at least a place of birth, a sort of an Iraqi birth certificate or a passport?
Yes, well, they're not, they're at risk of statelessness. So there's still an opportunity to resolve this issue. The problem is that they are born without birth certificates or passports. And I'll give you an example. We spoke to one woman whose husband was killed in an airstrike, is living now in a camp alone, has 3 children without any documentation, and she wants to get the documentation for these children, but she needs their father's ID in order to get the birth certificate. So it's a very complex system, the civil documentation system here in Iraq, and it's overwhelmed. So it's really a number of issues that is leading to this problem.
And there must also be a very wide range of nationalities here, of mothers that have these children that were born in these camps or born during this time, because as Mathew mentioned, there has been an exodus of fighters from across the Middle East, across the world, and these women were with the fighters moving around in these conflict zones.
Yes, I mean this number actually is mostly includes Iraqis. Actually, there are in Baghdad there you'll find a number of children of foreign fighters or foreign women in detention centers or in orphanages. But we were focusing on the plight of actually Iraqi children who are born in Iraqi territory and the challenges that they face even in their own country.
And could you give us an idea of what kind of future lies ahead if this situation is not resolved anytime soon for these children?
Yeah, well, at the moment, they are not able to access the same services as other Iraqi citizens or exercise the same rights as other Iraqi citizens. So, for example, if you don't have an ID, you can't attend formal schools. And if, in many cases, there are exceptions made and children can attend classes, but they won't be able to matriculate in the future. They won't be able to access formal employment if this issue is not resolved immediately. And they won't be able to travel through checkpoints across their own country. There's still an opportunity to address this issue now while they're young. But if this issue is not addressed, then they're essentially going to have different rights as their fellow citizens.
Is there also a problem of discrimination that they could face because as a result of not having a proper identification and hence the same opportunities?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely stigma in the community if you don't have civil ID. There is a perception that those without IDs have some sort of affiliation to ISIS, but that's not actually the case. There are a number of reasons why children today and their parents may not have IDs, as I mentioned earlier. Many of them lost them when they were fleeing ISIS's brutal rule. And again, this is something that the Iraqi government with its international partners can resolve now with the political will to do so.
So, Mr. Christian, how much of a risk is the situation of these children in joining ISIS in the future if something is not done quickly to give them some kind of place or their documentation, get those in order?
I think there's going to be risks either way, but of course there's an increased risk if those children are in fact disenfranchised within their community, have no significant rights to kind of build a normal life. Well, in that case, of course, there's a very fertile breeding ground, that's for sure. And in any case, there is a breeding ground regardless of whether we can help them. But it's going to be even worse if the international community doesn't help them. And of course, the community in Iraq foremost.
We're also joined by Belkis Wille, Human Rights Watch member from Beirut. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Belkis. If we're talking about these 45,000 potentially stateless children in Iraq who have suspicious ties to ISIS, in terms of a human rights perspective, what is it that the international community can do to prevent them spiraling out and joining networks that will essentially add to the security threat in the world?
Well, I think, as Human Rights Watch, what we really focus on are rights abuses and the fact that children, as well as adults, should never be collectively punished for things that relatives are said to have done. What we're talking about, as you say, are children whose parents maybe have joined the group ISIS, maybe haven't. But now the policies of the Iraqi government are really cutting them off from any and all access to their most fundamental and basic rights, including education, including welfare, healthcare, etc. And I think the repercussions of this in the long term for these children and families, but also for Iraqi society, are very serious. If Iraq is to become a stable country in the future, the Iraqi government, as well as the international community, should be doing everything possible to reintegrate families from across Iraq into communities, including families that had loved ones who joined ISIS.
But what of the mothers who don't want to reintegrate in society and want to continue their affiliations with ISIS? What becomes of their children then?
Again, children should never be punished for the choices of their parents. Children who are foreign should be repatriated home to their countries of origin. Governments around the world should be taking every effort to help repatriate children and reintegrate them at home with relatives or in some other setup to make sure that these kids really get a chance to re-enter school and a normal life. Otherwise, you are risking these kids being further marginalized and perhaps pushed in the same radical direction as their parents may have been.
Well, that would be an ideal path. What is actually happening on the ground? Are countries eager to take these children back or making any kind of effective moves to allow this repatriation?
It really depends on the country, which I think what's so unfortunate that we see some countries, particularly countries like Russia, have taken active efforts to repatriate quite a number of children and indeed some of the women. And then other countries have been much slower, including different countries in Central Europe, where you have children, Turkey, where you have hundreds of children that are sitting in prisons and in camps. And so unfortunately for these children, it really depends on what country you are from, whether your government is really going to be taking those extra efforts to try and repatriate you home. Children are simply in limbo, sitting and waiting, and and they just have to hope they're from a country that is willing to take the steps to repatriate them home.
In Iraq itself, does it have the kind of resources? I mean, this is a country that has been war-torn for so many different pockets of time in the past. Is it in a situation where it can give that kind of support, can have those kind of not just psychological rehabilitation services, but others to help these children?
Countries around the world who have been affected by radical groups have developed rehabilitation and reintegration programming. There are programs like this in Nigeria. There are programs in Somalia. There are programs in Sierra Leone. Many countries that have been wrecked by conflict. And a lot of these countries have actually benefited from the support of the international community. And donors have provided funding through UNICEF and other groups to provide for rehabilitation programming, for social support for children. You have to imagine that some of these children have really lived through extreme horrors that they've seen with the fighting around them, perhaps with what their parents have exposed them to, and what they need is sustained psychosocial support, and that is the most effective way of helping them reintegrate into a normal life. So Iraq and the international community really have no choice but to find the resources and put them in the right direction if they don't want to risk these kids being potentially radicalized in the future.
There's also a big problem with displacement camps also, these refugee camps, where themselves are turning into bigger breeding grounds for terrorist recruitment because they're so understaffed, they're so under-resourced. I mean, it's a really big vicious cycle just waiting to explode, isn't it? I mean, we're talking about camps in Syria, we're talking about camps in Yemen and across the Middle East.
I do think, as you say, the risk of keeping families locked up in the middle to long term in this kind of a camp setting with dwindling resources does represent a risk, not only to these families' basic rights, but also to their psychological state and potentially an attractive notion of further radicalization, which is again why governments urgently need to do what they can to take home their nationals as quickly as possible, reintegrate them as quickly as possible, investigate particularly adults who may have been perpetrators of a crime, including war crimes, right? So holding accountable those that have been implicated in crimes, but then again, effectively getting kids home, getting them into school, getting them into the right family setups so that you avoid these camps becoming breeding grounds.
All right. Thank you so much, Belkis, for your wonderful insight there on these children here. And it also highlights this point, Mr. Mathew, that ISIS in itself is an ideology, is clearly not one physical, solid group. And like these children are right now being in the deplorable conditions that they are facing an existential threat that what will be their future. And this is the kind of opportunities that ISIS is looking to cultivate, even if they are at their lowest, no?
Yes, definitely. They will continually try and recruit within countries throughout the world. They really have an ideology of it is ISIS versus the rest of the world, and so they will definitely target young individuals that they feel that they can influence easily through their ideology. And
Baghdadi in his video message also mentioned the fallen leadership of Algeria and Sudan, and again we're seeing that happening as a result of civil unrest, which is a big majority of those groups are of very young, enterprising individuals of those countries. So again, it seems like a perfect, or is it too optimistic, is it too ambitious to say, a perfect breeding ground for ISIS to reappear in such situations?
Yeah, I tend to agree because, like you just said, you have a lot of young individuals that are looking to belong to a certain type of group. And that is really what these terrorist organisations prey on. They prey on individuals who may be a little bit outcast, don't have a lot of friends, and they want to belong to a group. Right. And specifically when you're in countries that are going through a lot of these issues, you have a lot of those individuals. Right.
So, Mr. Christian, we have the last minute, and I want to get your closing comments on where is it that the global strategy and the organizational sort of equipped with dealing with these terrorist groups, especially ISIS, has failed. And as a result, we continue to see them regrouping and re-strategizing and reappearing in different parts of the world.
Well, the reality of fighting terrorism is that terrorist groups rarely die. If we look at all the terrorist groups all around the world, what we see is kind of increases and decreases much more than actual physical death of groups. So what we're seeing at the moment, to an extent, is the outcome of pushing ISIS down, of weakening ISIS over the last couple of years. But of course, there's a reappearance in other specters and other kind of theaters. And this is what is going to happen with terrorism more generally. Right. We don't tend to eradicate terrorist groups.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Khan, for your input there. And Ms. Alexandra, your closing remarks, please, on the way forward for not just a strategy, a global strategy, or elsewise for these children, and how to prevent a situation like this again developing elsewhere.
Yeah, well, what's very clear is that the Iraqi government and the international community is investing extensively in restoring basic services and public institutions in Iraq. And this must be paired with pressure to create procedures and invest in the infrastructure to get these children documented as quickly as possible so that they too can benefit from the same services as other Iraqi citizens.
Right. Thank you so much, Ms. Alexandra, and also Mr. Mathew and Mr. Christian for giving us your wonderful insight on this huge topic, which we unfortunately could only cover so much because now we have to take a quick short break. We'll be right back. Hello and welcome back to Newswire. Now we will be discussing the situation in Sudan as it has evolved in the past 2 months, of course, and 16 weeks of civilian protests that started against high prices of bread and fuel soon led to the fall of President Omar al-Bashir. Of course, he had been ruling Sudan for 30 long years. Now, the military promptly stepped in and created a transitional military council to negotiate with the protesters who have been demanding a civilian government, a democratic government. Now, the councils even claim that they're ready to step down as early as a month if a government is in a position to be formed. But the feeling on the street seems to be, from various reports, that despite Omar al-Bashir's fall, most protesters are worried that their revolution is unfinished and it's still in a very vulnerable position. Even now, thousands of protesters have been camping outside the army headquarters in Khartoum, almost 3 weeks after the military and security forces essentially removed Omar al-Bashir from power on April 11th. Now, protesters and activists have been negotiating with the military in this transitional military council to form a joint civilian military body to basically oversee the transition from what it is to a democratic government. But opposition groups say that it must be civilian-led and have a promise that they will remain sitting outside the defense ministry until their demands are met. But it seems like almost the military is losing patience, as just today reports of them warning that no more chaos will be tolerated have cropped up as protests are underway. We have with us Ms. Ola Diab, a journalist joining us from Doha, and we have Mr. Patrick Oyet, a correspondent joining us from Juba. He just returned from Khartoum, so we are eager to hear what the developments on the ground there are. And we also have Rozan Ahmed, a philanthropist from Dubai, who will be talking about the women's role in Sudan during these protests and how it is highlighting a changing shift in the society there. Let me start with you, Mr. Patrick. What can you tell us about your trip to Khartoum recently, especially in light of the impasse that it seems to be growing between the military and the protesters?
Yes, the situation in the Sudan was already getting to a situation whereby tension was not there, because on Saturday there was an announcement that the military and the representatives of the protesters had agreed actually to form a joint government. So somehow the tension was going down, people were hopeful, but then so many things happened behind the scene. We had a lot of things. Of course, some of these things when negotiations are going on cannot be conclusive because they change. But one of the things we've had is that the government, the military council and the representative of the protesters had agreed, actually, even on the numbers of people to be represented on the would-be joint government. But one thing that triggered all this tension is that the army was saying that the representatives of the protesters were supposed to actually ask the protesters to go back home to clear the roads, to clear the railway lines, and to clear the bridges. This was objected to by the protesters or the representatives of the protesters. The situation is that the army were looking for a situation that would, according to the protesters, put them on a weaker side. With the protesters, for them, they see like the only strength they have is the people being on the streets. If the people people go home and they leave the streets, then they would be on a weaker side. And also, this is now politics playing here, because perhaps the army or the military council thought that by staying longer, by prolonging the negotiations, the protesters would get tired and go home. Whereas the representatives of the protesters think that by the protesters staying longer on the street, they would push the army to actually hand over power to the civilian, which is not happening. Now, another thing we also are told by some of the representatives of the protesters is that there were actually some kind of agreement between the military and the protesters that they form a government without political parties, that the political parties should prepare for elections in transitional period for the joint military and the representatives of protesters to run it. But the opposition have refused. The opposition parties have refused. They've also handed in their own proposal. So you see the issue is becoming complex, because now there are many different parties trying to negotiate also their positions in the government. So that is basically how the situation is. And then, of course, upon hearing this, the protesters even came out now more to even reinforce the barricades, to stay more on the street. More people are coming to the street, so some kind of tension was created. And we can see military also getting agitated, because now they're saying they are not going to tolerate chaos, they're not going to tolerate indiscipline.
No, what Patrick, critics are saying, analysts are observing the way the military is handing over, it's a bit of a catch-22 situation. At the same time, when they come out with statements saying that we have not set a date for the end of negotiations, we are open to discuss whenever and whatever the conditions are that the protesters or the Alliance for Change and Freedom are asking for. But at the same time, we are seeing that there doesn't seem to be a genuine sort of move in handing over power for a democratic setup. Is that a true analysis of what is happening on the ground?
That to a larger extent is a true analysis of what is happening on the ground. And then one other problem in regard to that is the fact that the Sudanese people, the military council and the protesters and political parties, opposition political parties, are trying to negotiate a deal on their own. It would always be better to bring out some, or to bring in some regional bodies, such as, for example, Intergovernmental Authority on Development or the East African body, to try to help, or even like the president of South Sudan offered to help to mediate, because now these people, they are the parties who have interest in the same government, and they are the negotiators, they are also the mediators. So you can see that in this kind of a situation, it would be very difficult to make any progress, because one thing I can tell you is that when you are negotiating, you always, when you agree on something, it's better to sign the documents on what you've agreed on, you keep it aside, you move to the next page.
You move to the next step. Right. So that is something obviously not being seen right now. But Ms. Ola, what is your opinion? 3 days of talks between the Sudanese Military Council and the Change and Freedom Opposition Alliance, they've essentially failed. What do you think in the sense is the main cause for these talks not really moving forward, as Mr. Patrick said?
Well, the Declaration of Freedom and Change's forces have said that they feel that the Military Council is not seriously taking their request to have a ratio where there is equal civilian participation as well as the military participation in one council. And that is really where the delay is. They're not able to reach an agreement where it's not majority military and less civilian. They want equal ratio of each.
Also, do you feel that the alliance itself has a fluctuating sort of demands? They're changing, they're becoming more inflexible in what they want from the military? I mean, we have to keep in account 30 years of a certain form of government in place in Sudan. Is this reasonable to expect an overnight change?
It's not reasonable, of course not. It's been 30 years that they've been in power, so they will definitely not give the power so easily and in such a short period of time. So I do really think, I expected that the talks will take this long, and they might even take longer, which is why I expect that the mass sit-in will continue for as long as the demands are met.
Are you hopeful about the demands being met, or do you feel that there is some credibility in the intentions, in what critics are saying, that the intentions of the military are not to hand over complete power to form a civilian government?
I'm very positive. I am hopeful. I do believe that eventually they will reach an agreement, and that is really the hope.
That is really the hope. Right, so let's come to you, Ms. Rozan, who are also an activist, and you're based out of Dubai, and you have been making really strong observations of this kind of movement that is taking place in Sudan, where women are seen playing a very active and powerful role here in the protests.
Yes, they have, and what's important to understand is that the women of Sudan, as well as the men, as on equal levels of power and impact, have historically enacted in this way. This is historic behavior. It's inherited behavior. This is our third revolution. Sudan has experienced people's revolt twice prior to the Arab Spring. So this isn't something new. As a people, we are used to this equal stance when it comes to resilience and defiance against oppression. And in this case, we are now entering a realm of action as opposed to reminiscing and remembering our greatness. We are now in it. We're living it and breathing it. And I completely agree with Ola in the sense that it's not going to stop. The people of Sudan, particularly the young people, have tasted, even for a little bit, they've tasted freedom. The sit-in outside the army right now has been nicknamed the land of the free. And there are young people that are willing to die within this sit-in until trust and confidence is achieved by way of a civilian transition. My only concern right now is as Patrick put so in such great detail, is the constant back and forth, and there's 147 opposition parties, for example. The Declaration of Freedom and Change forces are leading the way, but they feel that they are constantly being manipulated and maneuvered through these political tactics of delay and so on. However, I am hopeful and believing in the people's resilience, and I really don't think this will end until there is a sense of confidence and belief in a democratic way forward.
In fact, the protesters have also asked their supporters and those out on the streets protesting that to get together on 2nd May and try to culminate for a 1 million-strong march. Do you have concerns about that kind of a gathering? And especially considering that the military is saying that we will not tolerate any more chaos.
At first, because obviously, we have been on the streets for 4 months now. At first, yes, I would have been concerned, particularly because of the attacks that were ongoing. Dozens of young men have been killed. Thousands have been tortured. So yes, there was a concern at first. But at the moment, the people that are on the streets who have, and by the way, have already hit thousands upon thousands of mass demonstrations. So at this point, my concern lessons because I've seen it. I've seen the fact that we are able to mobilize, organize, and protect each other on the streets. And I feel that it would be in the TMC's absolute worst interest to cause any further harm. So I am confident that this will move swiftly and safely. But again, my concern is in these continued delays. And I realize it's a tactic to tire the protesters, as once I believe you mentioned, but.
Right. No, absolutely. Even though the military, and here General Mohammed Hamdan just recently said that we have absolutely, and he's the deputy head of this transitional military council, he has said that we have absolutely no intention to remove the protesters, to disperse them from outside the defense ministry. But Mr. Patrick, this back and forth does continue to, as Ms. Rozan highlighted, to tire out the protesters when it's coming to issues like what is going to be the makeup of this, the civilian representatives to the ratio of the military representatives. I mean, there's a constant argument going back and forth. Where do you think this is headed? Is there going to be any improvement in the upcoming days before this million march?
No, I don't think there's going to be much improvement in the few coming days. And also, the only positive thing I have is that there is an order, at least, both the protesters and also the military council, because I was in Khartoum, as I told you, I came back yesterday, the airport is working, the system is at least working. So you don't expect to see much chaos. And I think that would make the protesters to stay as much as possible on the streets. But what I would like to also say is that perhaps the way forward is for the African continent and maybe the regional body not to leave the Sudanese to try to go to a worse situation. African Union should perhaps appoint a mediator or somebody to try to also oversee the situation, to leave everything in the hands of the Sudanese people alone, and just make ultimatums that we give you 3 months to fix or to hand over government to the civilian. It's not helping.
It's not helping at all. And Ms. Ola, also that the military is of the concern that these kind of protests, and we're seeing them grow, they're already in the thousands, and if they do culminate in a millions, in the million by May 2nd, as the protesters are trying, there is this continued concern by the military that they are paralyzing road networks, railway networks, and there are like 7 provinces that are in dire need of food security, food and water and other essentials. So do you feel that this is a legit concern that the military has for the safety of the country?
I'm sure the military is concerned, but I'm also it's been since the 6th of April, millions have come out, and millions are at the mass sit-in right now. Millions will come out tomorrow. This is definitely, it's expected, because a lot of people are very disappointed with the talks that have been happening the last 3 days. So I do not believe, although they have said they will not accept any chaos, what's happening right now is actually not chaos. It's people demanding certain things that are not being met. So the only way that they're ensuring that they are met is by causing a pause in life for these few days. So we've seen since yesterday and today, we've seen that there are more roads that are being blocked, bridges, making sure that the protesters will be safe, and that their demands are kind of loud and clear, so that the military does listen to them.
Right. So, Ms. Rozan, just to get closing remarks from all 3 of you, I'll start with you since we've just got a few minutes left. There was once, not long ago, just in the past few weeks, an opinion that the military is really working hard in trying to appease the civilian protesters, and even purging within the military council people considered to be close to Omar al-Bashir. But now there is a change of tack. Do you agree with this?
I do. The problem is there's a sincere lack of trust and a sincere lack of patience. So at this point, it's about proving. Yes, at one point we did have some kind of military alignment, and obviously this could well be divided, but there was a point of support. There was a point of hope with Burhan and his placement within as head of the TMC. But at the end of the day, the Sudanese people aren't in a position to be manipulated anymore. And this is about the deconstruction of the entire NCP. And we're talking about a system, a full-blown ecosystem that has managed to destroy our country over the past 30 years and divide it. Right. So there is a lot of work to do by way of proving support, proving by establishing infrastructure. I find it quite funny that the TMC are concerned about food security when, where was your concern over the past 30 years?
Absolutely. Good point indeed. Mr. Patrick, what are your closing remarks, especially when 6 security personnel, military personnel have just also been killed in recent clashes? In fact, it was on Monday that in clashes with protesters, they lost their lives. Do you think it is a change of tact or the intention was never quite there?
No, I think that Sudan actually has a brighter future. Of course, the situation now is difficult, but I also think that the military will actually apply a lot of restraint. They will not go ahead to try to disperse the protesters by force. And I think that the negotiations might take long, but eventually a way forward will be found. I don't see also chaos happening in the Sudan. I've been there as recent as yesterday. I've seen what is going on, and I believe strongly that Sudan will rise again and will be stronger.
Ms. Rozan and Mr. Patrick, for your time and insight into what is happening in Sudan. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today, and we've got to wrap up. But we will see you next week. Till then, goodbye.